Good evening, everyone. I'm Hraç Çilingirian, and I'm really, I feel privileged to chair tonight's talk. Tonight's talk is so timely. It doesn't come any better time because today the new parliament, the sixth parliament in Armenia, opened formally after the elections, and there were within weeks, literally, two major elections in Armenia, the parliamentary elections and just last week the mayoral elections for Yerevan, which was quite controversial, and I'm sure we will hear about it more. And I cannot think of any other person who can address this topic other than Professor Armine Ishkanian from the Social Policy Department at the London School of Economics, who's also the program director of the MSc in Social Policy and Development. And she's involved in many other projects and programs, but her research especially examines the relationship between civil society, democracy, development, and social transformation. She has examined how civil society organizations and social movements engaged in policy and politics in a number of countries, including Armenia, Egypt, Greece, and the United Kingdom. She is the author of a well-known book now, and probably the only one at the moment, on democracy building and civil society in post-Soviet Armenia. Professor Ishkanian has been following the developments in Armenia, I think, in the last 20 years or so, and she is perfectly placed to tell us more about this larger issue of transition, which we are hearing a lot these days after 25 years of transition, and about the prospects of social justice and democracy in Armenia. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ishkanian.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Dr. Çilingirian. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Program of Armenian Studies for inviting me, Dr. Grigor Moscovian and Rafael Grigorian and Leon Aslanov for their organizational support. So when I came up with this question, what are the prospects for social justice and democracy? Some would say pretty grim, but I thought it's important to ground that and try to think why the situation is the way that it is, and to try to think, are there avenues out of this situation? So, and I think it's very important to talk about social justice because we Armenians talk a lot about justice, but it tends to be about historical justice and not justice of today. So I want to focus our attention to what's happening at the present moment. The way I'm going to approach this question is to first begin to think about the transition agenda, because it's a key development. 25 years ago it was launched. What was it? What were the assumptions? And I'm considering the legacy, which I'm calling it led to a neoliberal form of development. Then I'll turn to look at Armenia's current socio-economic and political realities before putting all of this into a global context and thinking about whether or not, or how, and in what way social policy can be a useful tool or an approach to think about things. So when we talk about the transition project, you'll notice I've put transition in quotation marks. The reason for that is because I would like to problematize it. I don't think it's immediately clear what transition was. And there was this assumption that transition was this unilinear path from A to B, and that everyone was going to take that path towards progress. But 25, 26 almost years onwards, we realize that that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's important to also realize that transition meant different things in different countries of that space, of the post-socialist space. So when we talk about transition, what we're talking about is essentially two pillars. The first was liberal democracy, and the second was the free market economy. At that time, it was assumed that these were mutually compatible and that you could promote them together, that there was no question that they went in hand in hand. And of course, it was all going to happen very quickly because that's what happened in Germany after the Second World War when there was all of this money going in. And so, of course, this was the same. That was one of the assumptions. People were assumed to not put up too much resistance. So there were writings coming out in the 1990s saying 5 years maximum we're going to see this. Now we know, in hindsight 2020, that's not necessarily what happened. But at that time in the 1990s, what you had was a triumphalism of the West, very hubristic triumphalism, and what Fukuyama called the end of history. And I think what we need to look at is what Fukuyama is saying these days, because he's shifted, he's almost recanted what he said back then. So what I'm arguing is that what it led to was a neoliberal model of development. So before I start talking about the neoliberal model of development, because I'm going to be talking quite a lot about policy and policy processes, I just want to define the actors who I'm talking about and also how I understand the policy process. So when I talk about actors and institutions, I look at a range of actors and institutions and stakeholders, recognizing that there are power imbalances between them. So generally, when we talk about social or public policy, we're talking about the state as the key actor. But of course, civil society is an important actor, whether in terms of delivery or in keeping the state to account. And by civil society, I'm not just referring to NGOs or charities, but I'm also talking about social movements, grassroots groups, trade unions, of which I don't think there are any active in Armenia at the moment. International organizations, in particular in a country like Armenia, which was undergoing transition, quote unquote, and development, international actors have quite a lot of power, and I'll come back to that in terms of how they shape outcomes. And of course, the private sector is increasingly seen as a key actor in terms of development policy processes through privatization primarily and contracting. And of course, we can't forget individuals, whether we're talking about individual members of civil society, or sometimes what we've seen are celebrities within the civil society space. Now, I mentioned power, and what I want to indicate is that power and politics affect the policy process. Even though in the neoliberal paradigm, there is this tendency to talk about it as if it's a technical exercise, power and policy go together in the sense of, number one, who sets the agenda? What gets on the agenda? What is sayable and what is unsayable is important. The second question is who is involved in decision-making in these policy spaces? It's not everyone. It's a few people. And increasingly what we are seeing is that policy decisions are happening in very undemocratic spaces. So I'll give you an example of this. The Transatlantic Partnership Agreement wants to create, that has nothing to do with Armenia specifically, but it's an example, wants to create courts that are private. So trade deals can be negotiated in private. So even though corporations will be able to sue governments for laws that protect their citizens that might have some harm to the corporation's profits, that is not going to be held in public court. So this is an issue of who is involved and how. So when I talk about power, I draw on several theories, such as Luke's theories of power, where he talks about power over others, but also power to achieve a particular goal. But also, of course, Foucault, we can't get away from Foucault's work when we talk about power in terms of how it shapes ideas of what is considered normal, what is considered acceptable, what is considered the truth. So what I am trying to argue is that when we are looking at what's happening in Armenia, we need to focus on the power dynamics and the politics and the actors involved. So I'm arguing that we need to move away from a technocratic view of policy to one which recognizes policy as a political process shaped by power relations. I put that in English, but I'll say it in Armenian. This is a phrase some who have visited or follow Armenian Facebook will have heard. Anything that happens, a protest, an Armenian band gave a performance where the sitting prime minister decided to play drums when they were accused of being involved in politics, they said, "Chikara kakanasnel." So really don't understand this unease with politics, but maybe it's good to talk about it and to think about that. So I am going to kara kakanatsnel. Just saying. So let's talk about the neoliberal model of development. Before I go on to critique it, I think I should say what it is. So the neoliberal model of development emerged out of the 1970s, out of a reaction against state-led developmentalism. It's very much drawing on the work of Hayek, later developed in the Chicago School, and it opposes the role of the state and tries to shift both the delivery of social welfare and the funding of social welfare outside of the state, towards the private sector in terms of delivery, but also in terms of funding towards the voluntary sector or the charitable sector. And indeed, when you look at the philosophical underpinnings of neoliberalism, it's very much opposed to this idea of social or welfare rights, which were fundamental in the 1950s after the Second World War, and where we had the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where economic and social rights were signed alongside the civil and political rights. These are rights to housing, rights to social security, and so on, basic health care. So what neoliberals talk about is opportunity and individual responsibility rather than the state engaging in a welfare process. And they reject the idea of social justice, arguing that what we need is a minimum safety net, a residual system that catches the poorest of the poor. This is the reigning system, not just in Armenia, but in many parts of the world, including in the global north, but also in the global south. Now, when we define neoliberalism, I think it's good to engage with it, not just as an economic set of policies, but a set of policies that tries to commodify every human interaction. And that's why I like Wendy Brown's definition, which I'll read to you. It says, neoliberalism is most commonly understood as enacting an ensemble of economic policies. These include deregulation of industries and capital flows, radical reduction in welfare state provisions and protections for the vulnerable, privatized and outsourced public goods, end of wealth redistribution and the conversion of every human need or desire into a profitable enterprise. That's how it changes the dynamic. So while in the 1950s, 1960s, even up until the 1970s, European welfare states had a particular relationship with citizens, what neoliberalism tries to do is to push the state out. So it's the radical reduction of the state. Now, many critical theorists argue that it's an apolitical or post-political idea that, again, Chikarakakanatsnel tries to move the realm of policy outside of politics, saying this is just technical decisions. People don't need to worry themselves. But in fact, it is very much political because it is about the redistribution of our resources. You pay taxes, someone decides where those taxes go. And what Loic Wacquant has done is he developed an idea called the centaur state. It's not that the state is not spending money, but it's not spending money on health, education, housing, and welfare. It's spending it on the military, on the police, on surveillance. So that's what he calls the centaur state, meaning if we imagine a centaur with a human head and a horse's body, if you are an elite, you see the human face of the state. If you are not an elite, you see the horses behind. So this is very important to realize that it is not necessarily about the state removing itself, but it's a state that becomes different. Now, it's almost been 10 years since the financial crisis. Difficult to imagine that. But when it happened, many said Keynes is coming back. The neoliberal state has had its time. It's the end. Of course, it's not the case. Now we know that. And Colin Crouch famously coined this term, the strange non-death of neoliberalism. And what we realize is that it hasn't died. In fact, it has become stronger than ever before. So before I turn to Armenia, just a couple of more slides to indicate the way and why social justice becomes problematic in this context is, number one, how neoliberalism views social policy. So it emphasizes individual responsibilities rather than social rights, arguing that the collective meeting of needs can be socially damaging because it takes away from people's responsibility and it creates dependency. That's the assumption. But David Harvey, who's written extensively, argues that if you assume that everyone should have individual responsibility, you're assuming, he writes, that everyone has access to equal levels of information and that there is a level playing field for competition. He says, if you believe this, it's either a belief in an innocent utopian projection or a deliberate obfuscation of the existing socio and economic processes, which basically means that you're not willing to recognize your own privileges if you think that everyone is starting out from the same point. So he argues that this is something we need to very carefully think about. Now in Britain, neoliberalism is often seen as having started under Margaret Thatcher. When New Labour was voted into power, they were very influenced by Tony Giddens' work, which tried to bring together the left and right positions to reconcile them through this approach called the third way, recognizing that rights come with responsibilities, but still seeing a role for the state. Now, it was an enabling vision, and it was about creation of opportunities. But what we've seen since the demise of New Labour is that so has the third way gone. And basically, we're back to a very harsh neoliberal system. Now, let's look at how all of this happens in Armenia. So when I've done research in Armenia, what I found is that the ideas that I talk about, neoliberalism or social democratic ideas, are very marginalized. People talk about them, but it's not very widespread. Stiglitz talks about in these countries, in the former Soviet socialist countries, you have what can be called this market fundamentalism, or what others have called the gospel of neoliberalism, that we don't question it. Because if we question it, are we going back towards the Soviet past? So there is this very uneasy relationship with some of the more progressive ideas. And indeed, you can find that what Margaret Thatcher called TINA, there is no alternative, is very much an issue. So let me give you a case study to illustrate how ideas shape policies. The PRSP, also known as the Poverty Reduction Strategy Program. It was implemented beginning in 2000 in many countries across the world, which were known as highly indebted poor countries. And Armenia was one of these countries. The PRSPs came about after years of protest by anti-globalization protesters arguing that the World Bank and the IMF, collectively known as the International Financial Institutions, were implementing structural adjustment policies that were leading to poverty and inequality. So the IMF and World Bank decided to shift how these policies were made and implemented and funded a participatory process. So in Armenia, the participatory civil society consultation process began in May 2000. And after 2 years, the researchers who were involved, there were 40 local experts, and it was led by 2 NGOs, published a report. It was the draft PRSP document. Now, I was in Armenia at that time as a postdoctoral researcher, and I had the chance to accompany these NGOs to different parts of Armenia and also in Yerevan to listen to what people were saying. And it was very interesting because people were telling them stories of what they experienced. A book came out, and I think this is a very important book. It's not one that's widely read or known about. It's called Պատմություններ աղքատության մասին, Stories About Poverty. And it was funded by the World Bank, and anthropologists led by Hranush Kharatyan, but also Levon Abrahamian, Gayane Shagoyan, Harut Marutyan, and others, went around Armenia asking people, what does poverty mean to you? Tell us about your life. And this influenced what the draft ended up being. So what the draft authors argued that macroeconomic growth, which is the main policy pushed by the IFIs, is good. No one's questioning it, but it's insufficient on its own. They argued that the present concentration of wealth in Armenia means that a very small number of economic agents limits the possibility for resource utilization. Basically, it's a monopoly. It's an oligarchy. And so while you can talk about economic growth, that growth is not leading to benefits. It's not leading to poverty reduction. It's not leading to wider income distribution and lessening of income inequalities. So they cited governance issues as being fundamental and redistribution policies as being fundamental. And they cited, for instance, how you could have high levels of inequality by measuring the Gini coefficient alongside double-digit growth in Armenia. What happened, however, is very interesting between the draft and the final versions. And I had both. And part of the work that I did was to go through these. It wasn't very exciting, I can say, and find out what got deleted. And basically what got deleted was anything redistributive, anything to do with good governance. And what ended up happening was that people, the experts, the organizations who were involved in this process became very disillusioned. This is from one of the NGOs. It says, the silence during the last 5 months from October 2002, when they published the report, until the final draft, compels one to suppose, unfortunately, that the means of the PRSP process were viewed as its goals. So it wasn't that, you are going to engage in this participatory process, you're going to develop your own poverty reduction plan and implement it, but you're going to do this, and then we're going to put that in the bin, and we're going to do what we've always done. And essentially, that's what happened. So they talk about, first stage, active participation, publicity, public relations. Second stage, feedback, discussions, and so on. Third stage, silence, information famine, indifference, and idleness. So that's not the best process. And I've published this. You can see the link. This was in the Journal of International Development. But after all of this, what happened? How did civil society respond? The government went along with it because they were going to get the tranche of payments. And of those NGOs that were involved and of those experts that were involved, only one NGO ended up publicly and very, robustly speaking out. And that was the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, MIJI. And they said, we consider it wrong in principle to participate in this process because our view is that it's impossible to change anything from inside of this system, and that participation legitimizes the institutions and can corrupt the participants. So what it raises, number one, is how international actors shape local processes and policies. It shows the power imbalances, and it also shows that because civil society is dependent on grants, it often does not have a very strong position. Let's fast forward. That was 2000. Now we're in 2016. This is all this information is publicly available. You can download it from the Armenian National Statistics Service website. According to that report, which was published in 2016, 900,000 Armenians are considered poor. That's 1 in 3 Armenians. And when we talk about poverty, what we're talking about is that every third person in the country is living below 41,698 Armenian drams, which is about 67 pounds. That is very, very severe poverty. And it's worse in rural areas, and it's worse outside of Yerevan. Now, when we look at that number and we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, why? And I'll be coming back to this. But of course, we also need to think about intersectionality and poverty. It depends on who you are. So age, gender, sexuality, disability, long-term health conditions will affect how you experience poverty and inequality. Women, if we disaggregate this by gender, 55% of the poor are women versus 45%. Girl children tend to do worse than boy children. And if we're talking about age, yes, the elderly are very bad off, but it's children. Which always surprises me because Armenians always say, we love children. Yeah? Okay. So, poverty rate in children, age groups of 0 to 5 and 5 to 17, is higher than any other age group. So, children are at more risk of both total and extreme poverty in Armenia. And again, I've given you page numbers, you can check this. According to USAID, today there are 4,500 children living in Armenia's 42 orphanages. But 97% of those children have at least one living parent, which means they are not orphans in the sense of natural orphans. So this is something that we do need to consider. If you talk about the children are the future. Yeah. So this is very, very depressing. Now, what this also indicates, and this is what studies have shown, is that extreme forms of inequality and poverty, it leads to very negative outcomes. It's not just people are poor, but it has long-term consequences for development. It affects the well-being of people, of populations. So this is something that we need to take into consideration. It's not something that, we can say, oh, well, these are people's lives that we're talking about. And that's why I don't want to just talk about the numbers. It's the stories about the people. It's where I've also traveled and met people. People in this book, they talk about how they're ashamed. They feel shame. They feel indignity, fear. It's a lived experience. At the LSE, we now have an International Inequalities Institute, and we were developing policies in terms of what can be done. Most so far tend to, again, come back to the role of social policy, public policy, and the state. So it raises questions. What can the state do? Now, according to the same Armenian report, which I just mentioned, they also talk about what it would cost to reduce poverty and inequality. So page 46, if you're interested, look at the report. This is what the authors say. To eradicate poverty in Armenia, they would need 71.4 billion Armenian drams. Convert that to pounds, that's 11.5 million pounds. That's not a lot. That's actually 1.4% of GDP. If you want to eradicate extreme poverty, all you would need was 1.8 billion Armenian drams, which is 2.9 million, British pounds, which wouldn't even buy a semi-detached house and a garden in North London. So this is equal to 0.4% of GDP, gross domestic product. What does this indicate? What this indicates is that, yes, the problem is difficult, but it's not insurmountable. And I'm not saying, okay, let's just give them money. But what it indicates is that enough money is not being invested in social in assistance and social protection. And it indicates that the problems are not insurmountable. And I will tell you something else. I've been teaching social policy and development, so I have students from around the world, from India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And when we talk about poverty, and I say, oh yeah, 1/3 of the people in Armenia are poor, and they say, well, how many people is that? I say 900,000. They're like, we're not talking about millions or hundreds of millions. So I just wanted to put this up here just to give some context. This is one of the sons of the Minister of Finance, who used to be the Minister of State Revenue Committee, basically HMRC. He and his brother purchased this mansion in Los Angeles for $11 million. Now it's on the market for $35 million. So just putting some numbers together for people to think about, and of where the money is going, and how a civil servant is able to afford an $11 million dollar house. Another way, and my second case study, people talk about mining in Armenia as an important driver of economic growth. Mining, and this is from the World Bank, according to the World Bank, from 2011 to 2016, Armenia's mining exports amounted to approximately $500 million annually, making it the country's top sector in terms of export and inflow of foreign exchange. That's a substantial amount. Remember, 2.9 million is all you need to eradicate. And the mining sector in Armenia, according to Kirsten Hearn from the World Bank again, who's a senior mining specialist, she says, the mining sector in Armenia could, and I've emphasized and underlined could, contribute to sustainable development, but for this, the sector needs to be advanced in an environmentally and socially responsible manner, and the benefits have to be equitably shared, which indicates it's not at present being equitably shared. And yet mining as an industry continues to grow and to expand. Now, one positive development is that Armenia joined the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative a couple of months ago. This is indeed a good step if it leads to more transparency about what is being earned and what is being paid and so on and so forth. But I would caution against becoming overly enthusiastic for two reasons. One is that it can lead to tick-the-box forms of compliance, also known as zombie compliance within the literature. But you also need a very powerful civil society to hold the corporations to account. So it's not enough just to have transparency. If they're not acting in the manner, how do you hold them to account? And also in terms of mining, and I've written about this as well. In terms of the dangers of mining, I think, one of the questions we need to ask is how much mining is needed in Armenia, because it's expanding. Why aren't the present mines being utilized, and why aren't the resources being gained from those mining projects being invested in the country's infrastructure and development? And do the benefits of mining offset the threats? And here we need to look at different kinds of risk factors. There is the impact on human health and well-being. There is an article which just came out last year written by Ruzana Grigorian, Vartuhi Petrosyan, Zovenyar Melkomian, Vahid Khachaturian, and others, which looks at how children living near metal mining sites had higher levels of lead, which for children under 5 means they have serious issues in terms of development, early childhood development. So the lead levels in their blood are higher. It can lead to severe and lasting damage to the environment and biodiversity. And thus far, there have been limited benefits to overall poverty reduction. So yes, it has the potential, it isn't being realized, and it's being expanded without even taking into consideration what the existing mines are achieving. Now I've pointed out the problem and almost hinted at what are some of the causes, but let's talk about them more directly. Because if we're talking about why things are the way they are not there for no reason. Decisions are being made or not made. As I said, who sets the agenda, who's involved in decision making. So what I'm advocating is a political economy approach, a perspective which considers the relationship between politics, governance, and socio-economic realities in order to understand how declining rates of democracy. At present, Freedom House calls Armenia a semi-consolidated authoritarian regime. Sometimes more charitably in the literature, it's called the managed democracy. But there are high levels of corruption. There are issues around rule of law. It's an oligopoly. And what we find, again, if we go back to the slide with the picture of the young man and his house in Los Angeles, is that, yes, corruption is alive and well, and what it's leading to is an outflow of resources rather than an investment in the country's infrastructure, in the country's development. Now, if that's what some of the elites, the political and economic elites, are doing, what role, if any, is there for civil society? Now, it's become a familiar sight every summer for the past several years to see protests. And nearly all of these protests are linked to social justice issues, whether it's the rising of transportation fees, pensions, electricity fee hikes, or so forth. There is an element of social justice. So what we need to recognize is that people are speaking out. What we aren't necessarily seeing is that anyone is listening or responding, apart from very transactional natures of issue raised, one small response, but not at the structural and higher political levels. And I think this is something that Armenian civil society and civil society of Armenians globally needs to be concerned with. And of course, the picture in the middle is a papier-mâché figure of an oligarch. It was one of my favorite actions that was undertaken in 2012 by the Mashtots Park movement, which paraded around the figure of the oligarch, trying to say a lot of the problems are coming from this type of governance. Now, if we think about civil society in the policy process, I'm not, blind that civil society itself does not face corruption issues. In fact, a few weeks ago, there was an issue about the Armenian office that was handling EU grants, where there was a lot of fraud and problematic ways of allocating grants, shall we say. So civil society is not a panacea, but if we have a strong civil society, it's not just about delivering services and social protection and social welfare, but it's about holding the state, the private sector to account. It's about citizenship and having a more active understanding of citizenship, which isn't just about demanding things, but also having a responsibility to act. And I think we've seen in the last few elections, the last 2 elections, where many Armenians have taken bribes and voted what it would appear to be against their own interests. Now, I think we need to understand why that's happening and to understand what's driving that process a little bit more. But what I recognize is that there are possibilities, but there are also limits of civil society action, because all of those actions that I mentioned were issue-specific, not wider structural changes. And I think it's an important time to have a conversation, not just of people in Armenia, but more widely. So I want to now turn to the diaspora's role in all of this. Now, of course, it's a spectrum. And there are investors, Armenian diaspora investors within the mining sector. The diaspora has been very keen to develop charity, barigortutun, to give money, clothes, things, which is, again, it's an admirable process, but it doesn't necessarily lead to empowerment, doesn't necessarily solve the problems of structural inequalities. There has been voluntourism, going to visit, take a picture of Ararat, come home. But there's also this initiative, Justice Within Armenia, which was a petition from last year, signed by several Armenians from around the world. I'd like to read just a part of that. It says, we say yes to the equality of all people, the fundamental preservation and protection of human rights, direct engagement in fair and transparent elections, respect for the rule of law, fair wages, separation of powers, a free press, and advocacy for the disenfranchised. They go on asking Armenian political leaders to have integrity, accountability, wisdom, intelligence. And then they end with this very important line. It says, we need to visualize an egalitarian state worthy of the resilience of our people and achieve it. Given our unique values and character, Armenia can and should become a country of opportunity, creativity, democracy, and hope in a region rife with turmoil. The alternative is unthinkable. I think we need to talk about what that alternative is. And why is it unthinkable? And is it something that is already here? Is it something that is on the horizon? Now, as I said at the start of my speech, this was a campaign. People involved included Serge Tankian and others. They put this on change.org, and they wanted 7,500 signatures. They got just a little over 5,000. What does that indicate? That we don't care about social justice? I don't know. So I've talked about Armenia. Now let's pull back the lens. This is a brilliant graphic from Oxfam. It says the 80 richest people own the same wealth as 3.5 billion of the poorest people in the world. And those 80 people would fit on this London bus, just to visualize that. So they're campaigning, what they call this, their campaign is called Even It Up. They're trying to address, because this is part of the social sustainable development goals, to address high levels of inequality. But of course, why some of this inequality is emerging is because we have tax avoidance. Companies, corporations, individuals, oligarchs are not paying their fair share. Remember that house? So the Panama Papers, I've just put that as a visualization, is not the only offshore. There are many. And what I want to just indicate is that Armenians did not come up with offshores. They did not invent them, but they've made damn well good use of them. So when you look at the mining industry and you trace where many mines are registered, you will see that there's a lot of offshore involvement. So where we are now is, I would argue, at the end of transition. If you look at the Washington Post article from a few weeks back, Fukuyama has pretty much recanted his end of history thesis that liberal democracy won, saying, well, democracy is actually under threat today. And what some scholars are asking are, is the question of, are democracy and capitalism compatible? And the first three are hidden behind academic paywalls, but Robert Reich's article you can probably access at Foreign Policy. And they raise very important points. And in Armenia, for many people, democracy is unfortunately negatively connected in their minds to their loss of livelihoods, to their loss of well-being, because the transition agenda was this two-pillar agenda. So when you talk about democracy, it's often seen in a very problematic manner. And of course, this also comes about because of the way some of the propaganda has gone. George Soros is funding this, and so on and so forth. So there is this tension around democracy in Armenia. But in terms of inequality, in terms of the rising levels of inequality, it's become now, and this wasn't the case even 10 or 15 years ago, something which is mainstream. While Tony Blair didn't want to talk about inequality, you can see at the bottom, I've quoted Christine Lagarde, who is giving a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, saying, she's quoting Franklin D. Roosevelt, famous social democrat, who said, she quotes Roosevelt, who said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have little." This is not necessarily what one would expect from the head of the IMF, but that's what she's saying. And Pope Francis, who I didn't realize was a big tweeter, says, "Inequality is the root of social evil." So what I want to indicate that it's not just the leftist academics or the Occupy movement, but it's become a mainstream discourse. But has it become a mainstream discourse in Armenia? Are people concerned about it? I have not necessarily witnessed that. And again, perhaps others doing more recent research have. And so one of the books I had the opportunity and the privilege to review recently is a book edited by Anna Zhamagotyan, Jana Andreasyan, and Armine Ishkanian. It's called Quest for Change. And one of the articles in the book by Jana Andreasyan raises very important questions about the lack of concern for social justice and how, while everyone from Serge Sarkisian onwards can talk about the importance of pursuing justice, because we Armenians believe in justice, it's only one kind of justice. So where are we now? Where we are now in the global context is that we are in an era of multiple and interconnected crises, from the security and armed conflicts, which are leading to migration and refugees, as we know, the financial crisis and its aftermath. Even though it's been 9 years, it's not necessarily the after effects haven't gone away. Countries like Greece, countries like Spain, even in the UK, we are still feeling the aftermath and the austerity regimes that were imposed. Environmental and climate change is another set of crises. And what some people call the death of democracy. These are interconnected, interrelated. And if we think about what's happening, well, what have been some of the responses? As I said, there's been an entrenchment of neoliberal policies, further austerity in many countries, and the state spending hasn't shifted. It still continues to be to defense, police, and surveillance to control the protests that are happening. Because in civil society, all of this, all these crises are leading to growing discontent, anger. If you look at the Eurobarometer, you see shift in trust, declines in trust in formal institutions and political parties and parliaments. Resistance is growing, not just through protests, but also grassroots solidarity movements, self-help, new political parties. And more worryingly, we're seeing the rise of populist parties, populist politicians on the left, but also on the far right, who are exploiting the discontent through promoting xenophobic discourses, policies, anti-immigrant sentiments. So we are living in very tumultuous times. So Armenia is not alone in this sense. Armenia is part of the world, but what we need to recognize that at the same time, some of those ideas are not necessarily having much sway. So I'm coming to the end, and I want to think about social policy approaches, because as I mentioned, we talk a lot about the neoliberal model and very little about anything else in Armenia. So some of the the policies that have been implemented or advanced in recent years are to develop enterprises, microfinance kind of projects. These are very small kinds of interventions that aren't necessarily going to deal with the problems of inequality or infrastructure and so forth. Now, one other approach which is becoming increasingly popular across the globe, both in developed countries and in developing countries, is what's called universal basic income, also known as basic income grants. Finland is one of the countries which is adopted it at a pilot level. So Switzerland is experimenting with it. Places in the United States like Oakland, California, but also in developing countries. Now, there are two very good books that address this. The first one is by James Ferguson. The title of the book is called Give a Man a Fish, which says let's move away from this whole idea of we need to develop individual responsibility, and let's face the fact that we are living now in an era of mechanization and technological growth. All you need to do is go into your local Tesco's to see that there are less employees and more machines, which means that people who used to work in unskilled labor are going to be more and more out of work. So labor is not necessarily going to be met with jobs. So they talk about the need for a new politics of distribution that recognizes that money is available, but it needs to be distributed in different ways so as to alleviate the poverty that is growing and will grow in the future if these technological advances continue. So, and what they also argue is that we need to recognize that there are different kinds of labor that are not always recognized through a formal market. So these can include creative work, caring for children or the elderly. And I'll give you one example from South Africa. When they implemented the basic income grant, they spent 3.4% of their GDP and gave the grants to 30% of the population, 16 million people. In 10 years, the country managed to halve the rate of poverty and to reduce hunger from 29% to 12%. So it can work, but there needs to be a state willing to invest in this. In lieu of a conclusion, I throw the question that I started off with to you. Are democracy and social justice important for Armenia and Armenians? I don't think we can assume this because some would argue that democracy is a luxury in an era of war, that Armenians aren't ready for democracy. I don't agree with that, but I want to put the question to you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very full presentation about the whole range of issues. And I'm sure we have many more questions than answers that we received. So we'll open it for some comments or questions that people might have. Do you want to sit there?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Thank you very much for the talk. I think you were rather harsh on the poor neoliberals and the capitalist system. Neoliberalism has not really been tried in many countries. It's not been tried in Britain. It's not been tried in other countries. It's mainly rhetoric. I think the problem in Armenia is the lack of empowerment and the failure of democracy and the failure of capitalism. And these are both, I think, the responsibility of the ruling class. They do not want the population to be empowered. They want the intelligent people to emigrate. They want the rest of the population to remain inactive and in poverty so they don't present a challenge to the ruling elite. But one way of getting beyond that is to introduce a capitalist system and to introduce democracy where every vote counts. In Britain, because old people vote more, they get the policies they want. In Armenia, if the poor people voted and were able to play a full part in the democratic system, they might get some of the policies which you might want with which tackle the roots of poverty and inequality. Capitalism, the idea of capitalism is that you need managed capitalism, which prevents monopolies taking over, which prevents, improper practices, offshoring, undercutting and, illegal ways of doing things. And I think capitalism needs to be instituted properly and democracy needs to be instituted properly. I mean, I agree with with many of all the findings you've come to, but I don't agree with the theoretical basis that you start from. And I think in my view, I don't want to lecture, but I think there must be ways where society can be opened up to hear the voices of everyone in society and empower the people through economic activity, not just through the state giving them handouts.
Could I mean, you're speaking in the passive voice, and I don't hear you indicating a subject that is supposed to do this. Are you indicating that it should come, democracy should be done in this way, capitalism should be done in this way, but who does it?
The Armenian people.
The Armenian people.
The Armenian people, but I don't know. The problem with these countries is the leaders have made themselves so immune to pressure from the outside world. They've grabbed up the rhetoric of neoliberalism and all the rest of it, but they haven't implemented it. It's just robber baronism. And I don't know how, I mean, the Armenian people have not been able to, as you say, have not been able to push for the changes that should be made. The international community is not doing so. The diaspora is completely ineffective in that. And Armenia is not an important country, so the rest of the world pays no attention to it. I don't know.
No, I see what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with your position on neoliberalism, obviously, because I think there's a lot of evidence coming from around the globe, whether it's in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa, where structural adjustment did, in fact, lead to problematic political and economic outcomes. But yes, in Armenia, perhaps full neoliberalism was not implemented, although we could argue about that. And what we've seen is an oligarchic form of it, bastardization.
Shushan, first, Shushan, Leon, and here. Then.
Thank you, Armine. It was very, very rich. Maybe rich isn't the right word to use, but anyway, very balanced. No, it was terrific. Thank you. And I've got a lot of questions, but I'd like to start with one really basic one. And that is that, as you said, $2.9 million pounds, whatever it was, is not that much. I mean, when I was in Washington 2 years ago, I witnessed over $1.5 million being raised in just 6 months for the social justice of pursuing the Turks for admitting the genocide, but nothing else. This could be done, but how is that going to be spent to actually achieve that? That's what I would like to know. How would 2.9 million pounds actually achieve that goal?
I think this is what the report is arguing, that it begins to give, so if we look at the basic income grants, it begins to give people greater amounts of money per month. So instead of the 41,000 drams that they have, which is less than $100, that you raise the pensions, you raise that, you begin to give child benefit, because one of the things I didn't mention is that households with many children tend to be far poorer, so there is this need to recognize that. So that's one way, but I would argue that that's not enough, because one of the ways that poverty is experienced isn't just through lack of resources, but it's also through lack of infrastructure, because in some of the poorest areas, it's about not having good schools, adequate teachers, adequate roads. So if we take a multidimensional approach to poverty, we need to recognize the way that poverty is experienced. Unfortunately, Armenia has only adopted a multidimensional poverty measure in 2016. So I don't think yet we have enough data to really look at that. And that's unfortunate because, again, for 15 years, it's been being used in different parts of the world. But for some reason, it wasn't used. But when you begin to look at it, is that there are different kinds of deprivation from the infrastructural of not having good schools or, roads, and all the way down to housing. Is your home heated? Do you have proper electricity? Things like that.
So just to follow up, so do you think that 2.9 is a realistic figure to have that impact?
That 2.9 was just to eradicate the most extreme form of poverty. It's not eradicating the 900,000. So it's a small percentage of the people, because not everyone is extreme poor. But the 41,000 isn't the extreme poor. That's just the regular poor. So if you can imagine, that's far worse. I think if you raise pensions, you will do far better, because I know people in Armenia who are now living on pensions that amount to $30 a month. or land. Yeah, so it's not, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Armine. As you mentioned about market fundamentalism, as in it's just an accepted agenda to accept the neoliberal norms. Right next to Armenia, you have Kurds in eastern Turkey and northern Syria who have been trying to implement Öcalan's idea of democratic confederalism. So I'm bringing us back to the ideological discussion. Due to also geographic proximity and historical connections, is there any way, in your opinion, so morally, what do you think of it as a political idea, and should Armenians engage with it, considering Armenians will be engaging with the land anyway? On a political level, what do you think of the developments in Kurdish regions?
That's a very important question. I think what it entails is having these kinds of discussions, because I think we haven't had discussions of alternative patterns of development. It's been accepted that this is the way. And so I don't know necessarily who you were imagining kind of engaging at that level, whether it would be a political party level kind of engagement or civil society. But I think what is important is to consider different ideas and to consider them critically. And I mean, one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that we talk about policies, we talk about ideas. You can never think about them as off the shelf, that you're going to pick it up and implement it. It has to be grounded in the empirical reality. So I would say it would have to be considered politically.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I have a couple of questions. The first one is related to the question that Susan raised, the 2.9 million to eradicate poverty. I wanted also to ask, how is eradication
Imagined?
Defined? So does it mean just transfer payments to the poor, or somehow empowering them to sustainably be able to earn their own living?
I think that's an excellent question in the sense, do you want me to take more questions? I think that's an excellent point. I think it is very much looked at in terms of economic transfers, because when you read the National Statistics report, it is talking very much at that economic level. I think the point you're raising is a far more intensive process of citizenship building. And I think a little bit of that has been done. I wouldn't say it's necessarily expanded, and this is something that a lot of sociologists in Armenia are tackling, that people complain, but then they never do anything. Or people complain and then they act against their own best interests. And so it's about, either don't complain, do something about it. And so I think what you're talking about is a process that, are you going to fund that process, or is that process going to come through an education system? And that's something that I think a lot of the civil society activists have started to talk about, is about the community level mobilization and education. Not necessarily through formal education, because that's controlled by the state, but through other forms of providing information.
So what we see, and also my second question is with regard to diaspora and the influence that diaspora is having on Armenia. So as you said, mainly it's transfer payments, it's charitable donations, it's charity, which unfortunately we see is being mostly, it's going into the pockets of the ruling party and ruling people. The question or the thought that I had is, should the diaspora stop spending any money on Armenia, sending money? Because in the end it doesn't really help the addressees.
That's a question I've really considered. I think, on one level you have to separate the remittances coming from individuals to their families, which are basically sustaining them. You can't stop that. You can't stop. But in terms of some of the charitable projects, I think we need a rethink. Sustaining an orphanage which takes children out of their families and institutionalizes them, is that really what we want to do? Or do we want to think about different models and ask the question of why those children are in those institutions in the first place? Because those institutions then feed into trafficking as well. I mean, there is that whole danger. So I think, the questions that we're raising it's not just about the money. And I hope, that wasn't the message that came about. It is also about governance. It's very much about a system of governance, in the sense that you can talk about money, but it's not just about, throwing money at the problem.
And my last question is, so knowing all of this and having a vision or do you have a vision about the future? How could this develop? What is the brightest future for Armenia as of the state of knowledge?
You're asking me at the wrong time, right after those elections. I'm not entirely very optimistic, I must say. You know, this idea of give people a voice. Yeah, people are exercising their voice. They're just exercising it in a way that perhaps maximizes short-term gains over longer-term gains. I don't necessarily have a happy answer at this moment, and I'm not going to, yeah.
So one last comment. I recently heard, sorry. Okay,
Actually, my question's a very difficult one. And you mentioned the point earlier about change.org and the lack of interest into the campaign about justice in Armenia for 5,000 people, which I thought at the time was pathetic, and I didn't understand it myself. So we have a interesting dynamic here that we've got interest in genocide issues. If that was a change.org protest about Turkey, if we had said Turkey has destroyed 10 blocks of historical Armenian buildings, or Turkey is oppressing Armenian people, I'm sure hundreds of thousands of people would be interested. We mentioned civil society, we mentioned poverty, and I know people myself who have no interest whatsoever. In fact, they say inchanek. So how do we get to the point where, because the people in this room are obviously interested. Yeah, I hope they're interested, that's why they're here. But the majority of Armenians in the diaspora don't seem to be interested. So how, we're in a it's not just Armenia, as a society that professes interest in society, our children, our old people, we're either lying or there's something else going on here because we're not enacting upon it. Because it doesn't matter how many times on JFA we raise this issue all the time, nobody's interested, they'll question it, some supporters. People do not seem to be interested in the justice of people within Armenia, and actually they don't seem to care about the future generations. So what can we do about this? How can we get our people in the diaspora to actually look up and take interest in the most critical aspects of Armenian society?
I think we need to take a longer term view. I think the conversations that we're having now, perhaps we wouldn't have even had, 10 years ago. So I think it's opening up that discussion, and it's a drip, drip, drip continual process of saying these things, of saying things that were once unsayable, and to say, well, this is not right. And I think, what you're doing as a small grassroots group is raising awareness. Now, if you look at, again, theories of social movements and change, it doesn't happen immediately. It happens over years. Sometimes it happens over decades. So I'm not saying that to discourage you, but just to, make it into an understanding that these processes take time. How you convince them is you have to create a narrative that people can understand. And I think sometimes that's been the problem. We haven't been able to boil down the issue of this is the problem. If you're looking at people who are poor, who are going and taking 10,000 drams and voting in this way, we need to understand why that's happening, and we need to have a different kind of way of approaching not just those people, but the wider.
But we're lying to ourselves if we believe that they're taking it just for poverty. That 10,000 drums, those people may smoke, they may drink, they spend that money on other places. It's not just about poverty.
They can.
They just think that that's what they need to do, or they don't care. And I think we need to deal with that, because that's quite a serious issue to deal with.
Absolutely, but I don't think they're only taking it out of poverty. I think some people are taking it because they're in a patron-client relationship with the person who's giving them the money. If they work for X and X is running for office, then they have an interest, a vested interest in seeing that X continues to remain in office. And I think this is what we need to recognize, is that the whole system is based on a very clientelistic structure. And no, I don't have a...
Yeah, so it's a time...
It's a time issue, because even if you look at LGBT rights, right? I mean, from the 1970s until you achieve marriage equality, it took decades. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to change people's perceptions, ideas, and thinking. I mean, some of that won't affect the people who are suffering now, unfortunately.
I have one question from online. We have someone by the name of Mr. Armine, whose question is, what relationship do you see between political outcry from the public and nationalist sentiments, as shown by the protests resulting from the daredevils of Sasun, the hostage situation last year? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I wrote about this in openDemocracy. It was very interesting because if you look at what the daredevils of Sasun were arguing, at least in their manifesto, not in every speech, they were, using some of the terminology that was used by other protesters. Like, we are the owners of our country. They were saying things about the injustices. But they ended up having far more legitimacy because they were war heroes. They were seen as a very kind of patriotic group as compared to some of the human rights activists, which are often denigrated as working for the West and George Soros and whatnot. So I think that shielded them in some sense from public critique, but it didn't shield them entirely from the government because the government labeled them as terrorists and put them away.
Thank you. I agree, being from Armenia, I totally agree with the image represented in your report. I wonder, and I really have been thinking about this a lot, if there has been a practice anywhere in the world, in any developing country, for the civil society to unite and raise one main issue. I know civil society is there to be free, to be, work freely on their own, but we can see that the protests you showed in the presentation from summer to summer, they're usually triggered by a change that government makes here or there. So pretty much they offer the agenda for the civil society to stand up for this or that issue, and then either the issue gets solved or not, but they go home at some point. So the civil society is not really proactive in that sense. Usually they get together for the elections, but this year we saw even the elections are not the issue that would bring people together anymore. So has there been any such practice that the civil society somewhere would just pick one main issue, concentrate all the efforts and try to solve it? And if yes or no, which issue would you suggest or recommend the civil society in Armenia to work on? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, in terms of looking at civil society success, yes, there have been several issues. One of the most famous is the international campaign to ban landmines. That started from a few organizations and spread. One of the parts of the success of the landmine campaign was that it was able to work vertically and horizontally to tap into not just the NGOs, but also the political parties and politicians, policy entrepreneurs and policy elites, but it was also able to build a very grassroots coalition that supported it. And because it focused on a single issue, it was able to target it. When we talk about issues such as poverty, such as austerity, it's very difficult because austerity is not one thing, poverty is not one thing. So how do you tackle it? And I think one of the issues in Armenia is that people come together, but then it's very difficult to keep that going. The Terut campaign, I think, is one example of where it was very active at some point, but then for various reasons, there's no institutionalization. I'm not saying institutionalization is necessarily always a good thing, but what it leads to is it's people get tired. People have lives, you can't be an activist all the time. And so I think it's about thinking more strategically. And there are, different examples, again, from around the world that we can give. And I can give you some readings if you're interested. The main point is that you need to have a strategy, you need to have a message, and you need to build alliances. 3 things.
Just related to the question from YouTube, and extending on it a bit, how can we reconcile the demand or the uncompromising stance of the Armenian government on Karabakh with demands for democracy? Because it seems like on both sides of the border, in Azerbaijan and in Armenia, there is limited demands for democracy, and they are always drowned out by the voices which are kind of warmongering to an extent. And we saw this in action in Azerbaijan in April with like a diversionary war kind of thing. So how can we reconcile, on the one hand, the uncompromising stance of the government and the support that the people give for that uncompromising stance with demands for democracy? Thank you.
And that's been a key issue. Anna Zhamagotchian wrote a very good article. It's available on openDemocracy, looking at the trap of national unity, and what she argues there is that this commitment to nationalism, this idea that we have to support the government at all costs, is sometimes leads to there's no democracy. And I think the government knows that. The government knows that really well. The question is, you now have a generation of people born in the late 1990s who have never seen no war in Armenia. So are they never going to see democracy in Armenia? Are they never going to see a better life? Because this war, I don't see, I mean, is it ending anytime soon? You know, whatever is offered seems to not, you know, go anywhere. And I'm not an expert on that issue, so I will defer to those who know more about the Karabakh negotiations and stick to the stuff I do know about.
Thank you for this very diagnostic presentation, because it's like taking our nation to the doctor and knowing where the problem is, like getting the blood test results. But my question is, because you presented in numbers, because poverty is a word, but we don't know what it means. Now we know it in numbers. My question is, I'm just an average Armenian in the average diaspora who knows little about these things. Probably my knowledge is about the level of manga bardes when it comes to social justice in Armenia. So my question is, when I get, let's say, an email like that, change.org, or in my country it was Renaissance something, for change, not because I'm not interested, I didn't respond, but because sometimes you don't want to get involved in something you don't know who's sending the information to you, and you're scared that you're going to destabilize a country which is far away, and we're sitting in the West in our comfortable places. You don't know who's starting this thing, etc., etc. And what happens is, at the end, we end up doing the same thing, sending clothing, etc., because that's what we know. So my question is, since you know these issues well, what is your advice to me, again, as an average Armenian who knows little about these things, so that when I leave here today, I will be also part of that change that can, as a member of the diaspora, be part of that change that can happen in Armenia?
I really like your question, because I think it raises the issue of what is our individual role and, you know, what we can do. And as you said, you know, there is this concern. It was like, well, who is this organization? And yes, there are a lot of new organizations, and some of them one can raise questions about. Does everyone have time to research them and dig deep? Who is this? What is their ultimate goals? Not everybody. I agree. I think with this particular petition, though, what they tried to do was not come out as a political organization, but to find household names, people that everybody knows. So the lead singer of System of a Down, Serj Tankian, and others, to say, this is not a partisan issue. This is all of us. And I think that's the difficulty, is that when we talk about global Armenians, all of us, who is that? You know, this is very difficult to kind of define. What is our sense of community? And yet, I remember in April of last year getting emails constantly saying, give money to this, or give money to that. And you're thinking, why? Who? So yes, I agree with you. I think the only way is perhaps talk to your friends, talk to people, and do some research and kind of see who are these organizations, what have they actually done, what are their manifestos if they have some, what are their objectives.
Just quickly, I think we also overestimate the capacity of the diaspora in what it can and cannot.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, it can also cause harm. I mean, you know, not every diasporan is well-intentioned, number one, and, you know, there is that famous case. Well, not every diasporan has the resources. Some have resources and they use them to buy sex from young men. And I will give you the example of the pedophile who owned a small mining company in the north of Armenia. He was jailed, and so he was an American Armenian. So names shall not be named, but the point is that not everyone who goes there is going there with good intentions.
Another online question.
We have one more online question. I shall read it out now. One of the questions struck a chord. Anti-Turkey sentiment seems more powerful than pro-Armenian Republic attitudes. Despite this, there are many small charities taking members of the diaspora over to work on small short-term projects. Would Armenia benefit from fewer, more focused, better funded initiatives instead? If so, can these charities be brought together to pool their resources?
As someone who studies this issue of charities and mergers and so on, I like diversity, because I think merging is not necessarily always in the best interest. Sometimes diversity is better in terms of having different kinds of organizations that offer different kinds of things. I think there needs to be coordination and dialogue, and I don't see that necessarily happening. But that's at every level, because if you talk to the international donors, if you talk to the foundations, one of their key complaints, and this was tried to be resolved in 2005 through the Paris Aid Declaration, which was saying we need to have more communication and more discussion. It's very difficult to achieve, but it's something that we need to do. So I would go for diversity over mergers, but that's just me.
One more question from Susan.
Armine, there's one major player that hasn't been spoken of so far, and it's very much enmeshed in the oligarchy and everything, in the state, and that's the church.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe this isn't the place to end the evening, but I'm just wondering. I'm opening a can of worms, but I think it's a can of worms that it's attached to part of the issue being we're not just talking about numbers and money changing hands, but we're talking about values and attitudes and what people are being encouraged to do from people that they respect. And also people following examples. You had Pope Francis up there.
I did.
So let me ask it this way. You know where I'm going with this. Have you seen any cracks in the wall? Have you seen anything happening within the church, for example?
Are you asking if I've seen progressive clergy?
Yeah, that's basically what I'm asking.
Okay.
And are they having an effect? I think we know about the rest of the story. We don't need to.
I personally have not, but I'm not well acquainted in that sphere. And in Latin America, if we look at the history of liberation theology, it was the clergy that worked together with, civil society to lead a progressive, anti-dictatorial, anti-authoritarian politics. The clergy at present seem to be reinforcing the status quo. That's and again, that's not something I've done research on, so I'm less comfortable kind of giving you an
No, but it would
authoritative.
be, part of your world.
It is. I mean, one of the I remember, when I was studying the Terut movement, one of the things they were very angry about was a very high-ranking clergyman in the region had gone on television and spoken very highly of the mine and saying the mine is really important and the mine owner is a wonderful man, to legitimize it, and in turn to delegitimize the critics of the mine. Mm-hmm. So that was seen as a big problem. And of course, people talk about, the bishop with the Bentley.
Yeah, it's the issue is that we're talking about a so-called Christian state that is not following.
But I think, that, as Haraj said, opens a can of worms. And I think, there's the gospel of prosperity that's also used, particularly in the United States, more so than I think in Armenia just yet, to argue, and it comes out of the Protestant ethic, to argue that if you have riches, then God wants the Jews to have them.
Wait, sorry, Armine, I have to disagree with you. That has been dead for a long time.
No, it's not. It's actually alive and well in the United States, the gospel of prosperity, and it's being preached. Yeah. I mean, we might say it's dead at a theoretical level, but in a practical level, it's happening.
There's plenty of Christians who don't believe it.
No, I know they don't, but I'm saying that it's still a strain. But yeah.
Sure. But just thinking of that question, though, is the Armenian populace, are they now losing faith in the church because of what's happening? I'm sorry. So reiterate that question.
I would have to look into that because I don't necessarily know if that's necessarily happening. But in perhaps some people's minds, there is a split between the church as an institution, as a cultural institution, as a heritage, versus some of the clergy.
So then does that not mean that eventually there will be a revolution? Because people cannot continue in this way.
People continue in...
No, but the question is that why is there so much apathy?
I mean, one of the things, I'll tell you an anecdote that came out of one of the interviews in 2011 that I was doing with civil society actors, and this was around the Kino Moskva. Kino Moskva is Moscow movie theater, which is in central Yerevan, and someone wanted to purchase it, demolish it, and create something else. And it turned out that the person involved was from the church or had connections to the church. And the civil society, some of the activists said, those priests. And this led to more people joining the campaign because, this is what one of my respondents said, because people in some places are fed up with the priests because the priests, for every little thing that you want, try to take money from you. You want to get married, you want to do this, you don't want to do that. So that antipathy led people to join that campaign. That was one of the very first campaigns that started these civic initiatives, that started people coming into the streets and doing these things. Now, that's one person's opinion. I'm not going to say this is what everybody thinks, but I think there is a concern that perhaps, as Susan was saying, the values are, there's a cognitive dissonance at some level.
Shall we take one more question there? Yeah.
Maybe a positive comment that support can come from places yet you wouldn't really expect. And what I've heard from a former colleague of mine who is involved in the IT sector and banking is that now there is a process in developing countries, many developing countries, including Armenia, to digitalize lots of processes, including election, maybe at some point much later, but a lot of bureaucratic processes that will be digitalized, which will reduce, hopefully, significantly the corruption.
Let's hope. So. But at the same time, I think with the last elections where the EU funded 7 million and some of that was used to buy cameras, the idea of the EU was that we have the cameras, so there's no vote buying going on. But the way that the vote buyers twisted it to the people they gave bribes to was that we're going to watch those cameras to make sure that you took our money and you voted the way we wanted you to vote. So technology can be used, for good or for evil. It's not always, a neutral. It's what happens in people's hands.
Okay, one last online question, and then we'll conclude.
This question was part of a series of comments as well, so I'll quickly read them. Some Native American tribes have become wealthy running casinos in the US. Every family member in the tribe receives a monthly income. Alcoholism and addiction are issues in part because they're idle. I don't think guaranteed income is a solution. It seems the model of education brought by the missionaries to the Ottoman Empire taught skills and instilled values to Armenians successfully. NGOs do this without religious motives in other parts of the world. How open are Armenians to perhaps extracurricular educational opportunities?
That's a really difficult question. It's a very loaded question as well, and I don't agree with their comments about Native Americans and the causes of alcoholism. Let's just be clear about that. I think that's a very problematic comment in my mind. I think Armenians are very open to extracurricular activities. We love to dance, we love to eat. But I don't know what else they had in mind.
Okay, I think this, we could have another 3 lectures and sessions to continue these discussions, but I think we're going to conclude it here. And thank Professor Ishkanian on behalf of everyone and those who are watching online for this wonderful lecture, and hope we'll hear you again very soon.
Thank you.